It starts with a whisper. A mother in Missouri notices a lump. A young woman in California wonders why her pelvic pain never goes away. A nurse in New Jersey buries her sister and stares at the Johnson & Johnson baby powder sitting silently on the bathroom counter. For more than a century, those soft white bottles with pastel caps sat at the heart of American homes. Baby powder was ritual. It was comfort. It was innocence in a bottle. And above all, it was safe because it came from Johnson & Johnson. Or so we were told. For generations, Johnson & Johnson marketed itself not as a company, but as a promise. Founded in 1886, it built its empire on the simple idea that health should be accessible, reliable, and above all, trustworthy. Their products were there at birth in hospitals, on pharmacy shelves, in every first aid kit. Band-Aids, Tylenol, baby oil, baby shampoo, baby powder. No more tears, the slogan said. And consumers believed it. Doctors recommended it. Hospitals endorsed it. Parents swore by it. But behind the warmth of that brand was a secret. A toxic one. What if the baby powder wasn't safe? What if it had never been safe? By the late 1990s, whispers began to circulate. Not in headlines, not on TV, but in legal filings, in pathology labs, in quiet conversations between doctors who saw one too many ovarian cancer cases in otherwise healthy women. At first, there were just a few lawsuits, mostly dismissed, mostly ignored, but the pattern was undeniable. Women who had used Johnson & Johnson talcum powder daily for decades were developing a rare and aggressive form of ovarian cancer. And when researchers dug deeper, they discovered something chilling. Talc, the silky, soft mineral that formed the base of the powder, is often mined near asbestos. And in many cases, it is contaminated by it. Asbestos, a known carcinogen, was once widely used in construction and insulation. By the 1970s, it was already infamous for causing mesothelioma lung cancer and other deadly illnesses. Its use became heavily restricted in many countries. But inside the baby powder aisle, it had never truly left. For decades, internal company memos uncovered years later revealed that Johnson & Johnson had known of the potential contamination risks. As early as the 1950s, scientists warned executives about asbestos fibers in talc mines. Independent lab reports in the 1970s confirmed asbestos in product samples. And still the company said nothing. It did not reformulate. It did not recall. It did not warn. Instead, it launched a public relations campaign to discredit the science-influenced regulators and maintain the appearance of safety. Baby powder wasn't just a product, it was a flagship. It represented the Johnson & Johnson legacy. Admitting even a whisper of danger could shatter consumer trust. So the company went to war, not with chemicals, but with the truth. It funded industry groups to produce favorable studies. It lobbied the FDA to avoid stricter talc regulations. It pushed back against researchers, intimidated whistleblowers, and commissioned independent reviews that always seemed to find no problem. Internally, executives debated how to neutralize studies showing asbestos contamination. They considered hiring ghostwriters to challenge unfavorable science. They strategized how to minimize legal exposure, even as complaints began to rise. Meanwhile, women kept buying the powder. Mothers kept dusting it into baby diapers. Athletes used it to stay dry. Generations grew up with the scent, associating it with comfort, never suspecting it could be fatal. But the body doesn't forget. In courtrooms across the country, stories emerged. Thousands of women who had never smoked, who had no family history of cancer, began linking their illness to a product they had trusted all their lives. Doctors began testifying. Pathologists presented tissue samples showing talc fibers embedded in ovarian tissue. And slowly, painfully, a dam of denial began to crack. In 2013, Dean Berg, a woman from South Dakota, became one of the first plaintiffs to win a talc cancer lawsuit. The court ruled that her cancer had been caused by Johnson & Johnson's powder. Though no monetary damages were awarded, the case broke ground. It forced documents into the public domain. It gave other victims courage, and more lawsuits followed. By 2016, Johnson & Johnson was facing thousands of legal claims. The company denied all allegations. It insisted its products were safe. It cited decades of use. But behind the scenes, it began quietly shifting. It sold off its talc suppliers. It changed its marketing. It explored replacing talc with cornstarch. And all the while, its legal team fought tooth and nail to prevent key documents from becoming public. They failed. In 2018, a Reuters investigation shook the corporate world. Reporters obtained thousands of internal J&J documents, memos, emails, scientific reports spanning 4 decades. The investigation concluded that Johnson & Johnson had known for years that its talc contained asbestos and had actively worked to hide that information from regulators and the public. The story went global. For the first time, consumers saw beneath the polished surface. They read the emails, saw the lab reports, watched interviews with dying women who had once trusted the brand implicitly. Johnson & Johnson called the report false and misleading, but the damage was done. Wall Street trembled, lawsuits multiplied. In July 2018, a St. Louis jury awarded $4.7 billion to 22 women who alleged the powder caused their ovarian cancer, one of the largest product liability awards in U.S. history. Johnson & Johnson appealed the verdict, but headlines could not be appealed. This was no longer just a product crisis, it was a corporate reckoning. And yet, Johnson & Johnson did not issue a recall. It continued to sell talc-based baby powder in the United States until 2020 and still sells it in some countries today. In press releases, it maintained innocence. In courtrooms, it paid settlements. In boardrooms, it considered strategic exits from liabilities. In 2021, Johnson & Johnson made a shocking move. It created a new subsidiary, LTL Management LLC, and transferred all its talc-related liabilities to this shell company. Then, it immediately filed for bankruptcy, a legal maneuver known as the Texas two-step. Critics called it a blatant abuse of the system designed to avoid paying billions in damages while protecting the parent company. Victims were outraged. Legislators began demanding reform. Legal scholars sounded alarms. But for Johnson & Johnson, it was business strategy. In their eyes, they weren't hiding, they were managing risk. This is where the story turns. Because what does it mean when a company known for healing uses legal gymnastics to escape accountability for death? What does it mean when the face of public health is accused of poisoning its customers? It begins underground. Deep beneath the Earth's crust, where minerals form under immense heat and pressure, talc is born soft, fine, silky to the touch. It is the softest known mineral on the planet, ranking just a 1 on the Mohs hardness scale. For industrial giants, it is a dream easy to extract, cheap to refine, and useful in hundreds of applications from paint to plastic, from ceramics to cosmetics. But Johnson & Johnson didn't want just any talc. They wanted purity, they wanted safety, and most of all, they wanted the illusion of perfection. That illusion started in the mines. For decades, Johnson & Johnson sourced its talc primarily from mines in Vermont and Italy, among others. These deposits, while commercially viable, came with a catch: they were geologically adjacent to asbestos-rich veins. Scientists had warned as early as the 1950s that this made contamination not just possible, but likely. The concern was not about isolated pockets. It was systemic, because talc and asbestos often coexist. Separating the two is neither easy nor guaranteed. By the 1960s, internal company scientists had begun sounding alarms. Memos obtained during litigation reveal disturbing patterns. One J&J executive wrote in 1969 that the presence of fibrous materials in talc was a real and serious problem. In 1971, a company toxicologist suggested exploring alternative ingredients to avoid regulatory trouble. But instead of pivoting, Johnson & Johnson doubled down. They commissioned private labs to test samples and deliver favorable results. When results came back showing traces of asbestos, they ordered retests. When those results were inconvenient, they were buried or reinterpreted. The goal was not to find the truth. The goal was to manage perception. And that perception had to be perfect. Because baby powder wasn't just a product. It was branding gold. In the public eye, it represented Johnson & Johnson's very soul, nurturing, clean, maternal. To admit it might be toxic would mean rewriting the company's entire identity, so they wrote a different story. Internally, company memos show executives brainstorming how to counter unfavorable science. In one document, A Johnson & Johnson executive proposed a strategy to start positive studies using third parties that could reassure the public. In another, a marketing manager noted that any adverse findings about asbestos should not reach outside our walls. The walls became thicker, the truth more distant. Meanwhile, the powder sold by the millions. In hospitals, it was used to prevent diaper rash. In gyms, athletes used it to reduce chafing. In makeup kits, it became a setting powder. For women in hot climates, it was part of daily hygiene. It was recommended gifted and absorbed into skin, into lungs, into reproductive systems. And with each use, the risk mounted. Scientific studies began to accumulate. As early as the 1970s, researchers found a potential link between long-term talc use and ovarian cancer. In 1982, a landmark study published in Cancer showed that women who used talcum powder regularly had a 92% increased risk of developing ovarian cancer. Johnson & Johnson was aware. Internal notes reveal the company tracked the study closely with concern, but again, the public messaging did not shift. The company's response was not to investigate, but to discredit. Johnson & Johnson, either directly or through third-party industry groups, began funding counter-research. They created the Talc Interested Party Task Force, which published studies minimizing the cancer risk. These studies were often cited in FDA hearings and regulatory debates despite lacking independent verification. In some cases, the authors of these studies had financial ties to the company. In others, J&J scientists themselves ghostwrote the conclusions. In regulatory circles, the company lobbied hard. The FDA considered requiring warning labels on talc products in the early 1990s. Johnson & Johnson fought it. They submitted pages of evidence, met with officials behind closed doors, and emphasized consumer trust. The warning labels were never added. Instead, the powder stayed white, the bottle stayed pure, and the lie grew deeper. It wasn't just the United States. Johnson & Johnson marketed its talc aggressively in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa regions, where regulation was weaker and healthcare access was limited. The branding was identical: clean, safe, soothing. The dangers were not disclosed. In some countries, J&J even bundled talc samples with hospital birth kits, directly associating the product with the first moments of life. As lawsuits mounted, internal documents began to surface in court. In one, a 1973 memo noted that 50% of tested samples from the Vermont mine showed asbestiform fibers. Another report from the 1980s warned of intermittent contamination, and yet the company continued to argue that their product was asbestos-free. This phrase became a legal gray zone. Johnson & Johnson often claimed that their powder was tested and met industry standards, but those standards were often created by industry groups, some funded by J&J. In many cases, the testing methods were outdated, unable to detect the smallest asbestos fibers, the very ones most dangerous to human health. Scientists called this testing to pass, rather than testing for safety. And still the public remained largely unaware, because J&J had one more weapon in its arsenal: reputation. For over a century, Johnson & Johnson cultivated an image of compassion and competence. They sponsored medical research. They funded nursing programs. They branded themselves as champions of public health. This trust insulated them from scrutiny, from scandal, and from consequence. But trust is fragile. As more women came forward, as documents were released, and as media investigations intensified, a shift began. The public started asking harder questions. If Johnson & Johnson had known for decades that their talc could be contaminated, why did they keep selling it? The answer increasingly pointed to profit. Talc was cheap. Its supply chain was established. Reformulating to cornstarch or other ingredients would have cost millions, perhaps billions, and risked admitting liability. Admitting the powder could cause harm would mean lawsuits, recalls, reputational damage. It would mean cracking the foundation of a billion-dollar empire. So they chose denial. The courtroom is not a place for poetry. It does not recognize grief the way the body does. It doesn't mourn children who buried their mothers too young, or acknowledge the quiet rage of a family betrayed by a product meant to protect. The courtroom speaks in evidence, arguments, and technicalities. But starting in the early 2010s, as the lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson multiplied, even the cold logic of law could not ignore the stories pouring in from across the country and the world. By 2016, over 1,000 lawsuits had been filed against Johnson & Johnson, alleging that their talc-based baby powder caused ovarian cancer and mesothelioma. That number would grow into tens of thousands in just a few years. The plaintiffs were overwhelmingly women. Most had used the powder daily, often for decades, as part of intimate personal hygiene routines. And many were dying fast. Some gave video depositions from hospital beds, their voices cracking under the weight of both disease and betrayal. Others never lived to see their trials begin. But the stories alone weren't enough. Plaintiffs needed proof. That meant linking talc directly to cancer, a near impossible legal standard given how long it takes for symptoms to appear. And yet, they found it pathologists showing talc particles embedded in ovarian tissue, scientists detailing the presence of asbestos in J&J's own product samples, and internal company documents, thousands of them proving executives had known the risks for decades. In 2018, the world watched in shock as a St. Louis jury awarded $4.7 billion to 22 women. It was one of the largest personal injury verdicts in US history. Johnson & Johnson immediately appealed, claiming the science was flawed, the trial biased, the damages excessive. But appeals courts upheld the ruling. Notably, the Missouri Court of Appeals found that Johnson & Johnson had displayed particularly reprehensible conduct. That phrase, particularly reprehensible, became a turning point. Suddenly, this wasn't just a corporate liability case, it was a moral trial. More lawsuits followed, more headlines, and with them came public outrage. Activist groups reignited old tactics with new tools. Hashtags like toxic baby powder and justice for J&J victims trended. Survivors formed advocacy groups and social media campaigns. Some launched documentaries. Others stormed J&J shareholder meetings with portraits of lost daughters and wives. Lawmakers took notice. Congressional hearings questioned whether companies should be allowed to file for bankruptcy to escape product liability, because that's exactly what Johnson & Johnson did next. In a move that legal experts called cynical, unprecedented, and morally bankrupt, Johnson & Johnson executed a corporate maneuver called the Texas Two-Step. In October 2021, it created a shell company named LTL Management LLC, transferred all talc liabilities into it, and then immediately filed for bankruptcy. What did this mean in practice? It meant that Johnson & Johnson, one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, was attempting to use bankruptcy laws designed for struggling companies to avoid paying full damages to thousands of women harmed by its product. It meant that victims who had already endured sickness surgeries and staggering medical bills might never see justice. It meant that legal strategy had overtaken accountability. The backlash was swift. Victims and lawyers decried the move as a deliberate abuse of the system. Editorial boards slammed J&J for hiding behind paperwork while families mourned real lives. US senators called for reforms. Judges questioned the ethics of the maneuver. And still, Johnson & Johnson stood firm. This was a faster, more equitable solution, they claimed. The truth: it was a wall of delay intended to break the will of the plaintiffs through years of legal attrition. And it wasn't just America. As US lawsuits made headlines, other countries began to look closer. In Canada, regulators reviewed the safety of cosmetic talc. In India, consumer protection agencies tested Johnson & Johnson baby powder for contamination. In South Africa, the company recalled a batch of talc products after asbestos was found. In the Philippines, women began filing their own cases. And in Europe, medical journals and lawmakers debated stricter controls on talc and asbestos-adjacent products. Johnson & Johnson began pulling back not from markets but from visibility. In May 2020, it announced that it would discontinue sales of talc-based baby powder in the US and Canada due to declining demand. The company insisted the decision had nothing to do with safety. But by then, few believed them. The phrase declining demand had become code for growing liability. Despite the global retreat, talc-based powder continued to be sold in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, countries with fewer consumer protections, fewer lawyers, less media scrutiny. In these places, the J&J brand still carried an aura of purity, but behind the packaging, the same dangers remained. Some countries began to fight back. In Colombia, activists staged public awareness campaigns using posters that showed a Johnson & Johnson bottle with a skull and crossbones. In Thailand, a group of cancer patients petitioned the Ministry of Health to test imported products. In Brazil, prosecutors launched investigations into historical imports of asbestos-tainted talc. But in many regions, the fight was uphill. Because Johnson & Johnson had another shield money, the company spent billions on legal defense. It funded lobbying efforts to block regulatory reform. It hired public relations firms to maintain its brand reputation. It created scholarship-sponsored community health fairs and gave generous donations to universities, hospitals, and non-profits, all of which made critical commentary more difficult. At the same time, the company tried to split its identity. On one hand, it was the defendant in thousands of talc lawsuits. On the other, it was the proud developer of the COVID-19 vaccine, hailed as a scientific breakthrough. It was the owner of Neutrogena Aveeno and Tylenol household names associated with care. It was the face of medical philanthropy, and in the eyes of many consumers, these dual identities blurred. Could the same company making life-saving vaccines really be responsible for decades of cover-ups? The answer increasingly was yes, because corporations are not people. They are structures, machines designed to produce profit. And when ethics collide with earnings, history shows us what usually wins. Justice does not come all at once. It arrives in fragments, shaky testimony, unearthed documents, whispered confessions, torn contracts. It is not always delivered by courts or enforced by police. Sometimes justice is simply what survives after silence. And in the case of Johnson & Johnson, the pursuit of justice has become a global multi-generational reckoning. As LTL Management's bankruptcy wove its way through US courts, victims' lawyers and lawmakers watched closely. If this maneuver succeeded, it could set a precedent allowing any powerful company to offload its liabilities into a shell corporation and walk away untouched and profitable. A dangerous blueprint for future corporate evasion. In early 2023, a US appeals court made headlines by blocking the bankruptcy deal, ruling that Johnson & Johnson could not claim insolvency through a subsidiary while the parent company remained solvent and thriving. For thousands of victims, it was a rare moment of vindication. The ruling didn't restore health or bring back loved ones, but it did expose the legal contortions of a corporation desperate to avoid accountability. But even with that victory, justice remained complicated. Johnson & Johnson immediately appealed again, buying time. Meanwhile, it floated an $8.9 billion global settlement offer to resolve all current and future talc claims. The catch victims would have to forfeit their right to future lawsuits. Critics said it was coercion disguised as compensation. Advocates argued that many women facing medical bills, chemo, and funeral costs would be forced to accept just to survive. Even those who received compensation described the process as hollow. One plaintiff said, "I didn't want money. I wanted them to admit they lied." But that admission never came. Johnson & Johnson has never publicly accepted that its baby powder caused cancer. It maintains to this day that the product is safe, the science is flawed, and the lawsuits are driven by opportunistic lawyers. It insists its decisions were based on the best information available at the time, but the documents say otherwise. The memos, the test results, the internal debates, the ghostwritten studies, the buried warnings. They tell a different story, not of accidental ignorance, but of willful protectionism. And that story is not over, because even as the US legal saga dragged on, new fronts opened overseas. In Europe, the pressure mounted. A coalition of public health researchers and women's rights organizations urged the EU to ban talc in all cosmetic products. Several countries launched independent safety reviews. In France, legislators proposed warning labels. In Germany, media outlets began investigating Johnson & Johnson's historical supply chains. Across the continent, the phrase talc-free began appearing on shelves, a subtle consumer rebellion. In India, public trust was deeply shaken after the Central Drugs Standard Control Organization found asbestos contamination in Johnson & Johnson baby powder samples in 2018. Though the company challenged the results, the damage was done. Several states temporarily halted sales. Mothers voiced concern. Health officials debated tighter regulations. In Africa and Southeast Asia, awareness spread more slowly, but it spread. Consumer rights groups translated court documents into local languages. Grassroots campaigns used WhatsApp to educate rural communities. In Kenya, women's cooperatives banned talc products from health kits. In Indonesia, student unions demanded labeling reforms. In the Philippines, parents took to radio shows to ask, "Is our baby safe?" The answers were not clear. Because even now in many parts of the world, Johnson & Johnson continues to sell talc-based powder. Despite discontinuing it in the US and Canada in 2020, J&J has maintained that international markets still want the product. Translation profit margins were still healthy. This inconsistency is not lost on observers. Why remove a product from shelves in North America if it's safe, but keep selling it in countries with weaker oversight? Why rebrand as cornstarch only in New York, while advertising talc purity in Nigeria? The answer is simple. It's not about science. It's about reputation management, risk mitigation, and market segmentation. To many, this double standard reeks of colonial capitalism, treating some populations as more expendable than others. It's a continuation of a historical pattern exporting risk, where it's least likely to face resistance. And yet the resistance is growing. In 2024, an independent coalition of scientists, doctors, and advocates launched the Talc Justice Global Network, a decentralized movement to raise awareness, publish findings, and push for international accountability. Their first action, a global petition calling on the World Health Organization (WHO) to formally investigate talc safety and issue new global standards. Within 3 weeks, it had over 1 million signatures. Meanwhile, artists, journalists, and survivors began reclaiming the narrative. A series of murals in Bogotá depicted women with baby powder containers spilling skulls instead of powder. In Buenos Aires, an art exhibit titled "White Lies" displayed empty J&J bottles next to medical records. In Los Angeles, a theater group performed a dramatic reading of courtroom transcripts. In Tokyo, influencers shared talc-free beauty routines with viral effect. Even investors began to worry. Shareholders filed resolutions demanding transparency and ethical reform. ESG funds debated whether J&J still qualified as a socially responsible stock. Some major pensions quietly divested. A few went public, urging the board to stop defending the indefensible. And yet through it all, Johnson & Johnson persisted. The company posted strong earnings. Its medical device sector boomed. Its pharmaceutical division thrived. In press releases, it spoke of innovation, life-saving technology, future-focused growth. The baby powder story was rarely mentioned. It had become a line item, a legacy liability. But for those who lost someone, it was not legacy, it was personal. There's a name for what Johnson & Johnson tried to do. It's called ethical laundering when a company buries its sins beneath layers of philanthropy, marketing, and innovation. When it washes its name with vaccines and hospital donations while denying its past. But no amount of corporate soap can scrub away the truth, and that truth is now out in the open. So what do we do with it? Do we continue to reward companies that lie until they're caught? Do we forgive institutions that poison while preaching health? Or do we demand something better? Justice ultimately is not a verdict. It is a commitment to memory, to accountability, to systems that value life over margins. The women who came forward in the face of death were not seeking revenge. They were seeking recognition. They wanted the world to see what was hidden behind a white bottle and a soft logo. Now we've seen it. The question is what we do next. Because this isn't just the story of Johnson & Johnson. It's the story of how corporations become trusted, how they become untouchable, and how if we're not careful, they become unstoppable. The powder has settled, but the fight for truth is just beginning.